Thank you very much. Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I must confess, I find this panel extremely challenging because I happen to live in the real world and I happen to live in this century. And so when we have members on the panel talking about and saying things like there is no gay bashing in this country, that's simply not true. And when we say that hate crimes, for the most part, aren't violent, unless you look at the case of transgender Canadians, when most of the hate crimes that are reported are violent. So we've had a lot of, I think, factually incorrect material. But I think for me, the question comes down to the minimizing of the impacts of hate speech. And so I'm going to talk very personally here as someone who has been the first out gay man in a lot of different positions. And I don't think any of you three understand what the result of the hate speech is for people in my position or for transgender people, for Indigenous women in Canada. I don't think you understand at all what happens in the real world. So when I was appointed to the police board some time ago, we had to have a discussion with the police chief about whether I had to have more police protection, right? Because there were people online, at that time it was early, but online, who were inciting violence against me as an out gay man. When I was elected to city council in a very progressive community, we had to have discussions about what would happen at the public meetings because of things that were being said and posted about the fact that someone, my favorite, someone should do something about me. I took that very seriously, and certainly my partner took that very seriously. And when I was elected to Parliament, I received death threats, multiple death threats. And I had to meet with the police chief and have a discussion about what was an appropriate response to those threats. Some were very explicit, some were less explicit. And my conversation with the police chief was, if I'm a member of Parliament and somebody who's been an out public figure by that time for almost 2 decades, and this is being directed at me, what is being directed at other members of my community? What are they facing on a daily basis? And if we don't do something about that, then we are in fact encouraging it to go on. And so the police chief that I worked with, very progressive, saying, surely you're not talking about arrests. And I said, of course I'm not talking about arrests. But I'm talking about some door knocking with those who've directly threatened me, saying that this behavior is unacceptable and it needs to stop. And there were a number of cases where the police did agree to do that. And in my case, I was not worried on a daily basis that any of those particular individuals which we'd identified would come after me, although it was possible. I was, as I said, worried about the impact of that kind of speech and that kind of behavior on other members of my community. I would have to say that for me, when I first arrived in Parliament, there was an official statement done by a party, which I won't name today, suggesting that I was a friend of pedophiles. Now, you might say that's free speech. My argument with the Speaker was that impaired my ability to do my job as a member of Parliament. So by identifying me with a quite reviled and justly so group in society, people were affecting my ability to act as a member of Parliament. Unfortunately, the Speaker at that time never ruled on that question. And I would have to say that perhaps that was a statement by an outlier because that didn't happen again in Parliament. But it was necessary for me to speak up at that point to prevent the continuation of that kind of speech. So when you, and all three of you have done this, when you minimize the impact of hate speech on people's daily lives, I think you miss the entire point of these hearings. The entire point of these hearings is not about criminalizing speech. It's about deciding where in a modern society where social media have, in fact, become the public square, where do we draw the line? And so the old cliche, we all know that there are limits on speech. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater. So the problem is defining where that crowded theater is these days. And quite often that crowded theater is online and is the internet. And so what this committee is trying to do in these hearings is figure out where to draw that line. What's the appropriate place? It's not trying to ban speech or ideas. And I would have to say, because one of you did say it, that we need to debate these ideas so we know what's wrong with them. And I would submit we already know what's wrong with racism. We already know what's wrong with homophobia. We already know what's wrong with misogyny. What we're trying to do is to make sure that those ideas have less impact on real lives of people in our society. And so I guess I reject almost everything that you said today because the context you place it in is academic, is historical, and has no relation at all to what happens in the real world. And so I believe, Mr. Chair, that we're out of time as a committee, so I will leave my comments there.
Well, there was no, he didn't ask any questions, Mr. Stein, and that's a member's prerogative to just make a statement and not ask questions. Mr. Sassy is next. Mr.